A mail-order bride collapsed near the barn. The mountain man lifted her and whispered, "You're home." The mountain wind howled down from the high ridges, sweeping over the valley like a living thing that meant to erase every trace of man. Jonah Hale had been chopping wood behind the barn when he saw her. Small, stumbling, her dress too thin for the storm, clutching a paper bundle against her chest. She made it 3 more steps before her knees buckled in the snow. He dropped the axe without thinking, his boots breaking through the drift as he reached her side. Her skin was white as the frost on the fence rails, lips blue, eyes half open but still moving, searching. "Don't you quit now," he muttered, sliding his arms beneath her. She weighed almost nothing. The letter tied to her sleeve was half frozen. The ink smeared but legible enough. Mrs. Clara Harlow, bride to Mr. Jonah Hale, Silver Creek Cabin, Dakota Territory. His stomach dropped. He hadn't ordered a bride. The ad had been his neighbor's doing, a cruel joke, he'd thought, meant to chase him from his solitude. But this woman wasn't a letter. She was breathing, barely. He carried her inside, the door slamming behind them as the storm swallowed the world. The cabin smelled of pine and ash. He laid her by the fire, stripped off his coat, and covered her with a wool blanket. Steam rose from her dress as the warmth fought its way back into her bones. Her fingers twitched. Jonah knelt, listening for her breath, slow but steady. She whispered something he couldn't catch. He leaned closer. "Say it again." Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with cold. "Home," she murmured, voice raw as gravel. He froze. No one had said that word in this house since his wife died 2 winters ago. The fire cracked, throwing light across her face, young, dirt-streaked, fragile but alive. Jonah sat back on his heels, staring at her, unsure if he'd been cursed or chosen. Outside, the snow thickened until even the barn disappeared. He poured water from the kettle and held it to her lips. "Easy," he said quietly. "You're safe now." Her hand found his sleeve weakly, clutching it like it was the only real thing in the world. Jonah swallowed hard, the words she'd spoken still hanging in the warm air between them. "You're home," he whispered back, not knowing yet if it was a lie, a promise, or something in between. By dawn, the storm had sealed the cabin from the world. Snow pressed against the windows, muting every sound except the pop of the fire and the faint rhythm of the woman's breathing. Jonah hadn't slept. He'd sat by her side all night, feeding the fire and checking the pulse that kept surprising him. When she stirred, her eyes opened slowly, confused and glass-bright. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Silver Creek," he said, his voice gravel from cold and worry. "My name's Jonah Hale. You were half frozen outside my barn." She looked around the cabin, the stacked firewood, the rough-hewn table, the rifle on the wall, then back to him. "You're the man from the letters?" He frowned. "No, I didn't write any letters." Her brow furrowed, and her fingers clutched the blanket tighter. The agency said Jonah Hale, widower, 37, ranch hand. A man of honest means and steady nature. His jaw tightened. "That's me, but I never asked for a wife." She stared at him for a long time, her lips trembling. "Then who sent for me?" He didn't have an answer. He rose and poured her a cup of water, setting it beside the bed. "Drink slow. You're safe here till the snow clears." Her voice cracked when she spoke again. "They said you'd build me a home." Jonah turned toward the fire, the heat biting at his face. "Already built one," he muttered. "Didn't plan on sharing it." She didn't reply, but her eyes followed him, curious, cautious, studying the man who'd pulled her out of death. After a long silence, she whispered, My name's Clara. He nodded once, still facing the flames. Reckon it's a good name. The words hung there, awkward and quiet, until she drifted back to sleep. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying the fences and the trail to town. Jonah sat again by the fire, glancing toward her every few breaths. The letter still lay on the table, edges curled from heat, a ghost of ink spelling out both their names. He stared at it for a long time, thinking of whoever had decided to play God between two lonely souls. Then he looked back at her and saw a tear slide down her cheek, even in sleep. "Guess you came a long way to find nothing," he said softly. But even as he spoke it, a strange warmth rose in him. Quiet, unfamiliar, and impossible to bury. The third day came without sun, only a dull gray light seeping through the cracks of the shutters. The storm had trapped them together, and the world beyond the cabin was nothing but silence. Jonah moved about quietly, splitting kindling, mending a harness, boiling water, work that kept his hands busy and his thoughts away from the woman still resting by the fire. Clara had barely spoken since that morning. When she tried to stand, her legs failed her, and Jonah caught her before she hit the floor. She didn't thank him, didn't need to. Their eyes met for a moment, hers searching, his unreadable, and then he helped her back to the chair. She sat there, bundled in the blanket, staring into the flames while he poured her tea. The kettle whistled once, sharp and lonely. He placed the cup in her hands and turned away, pretending not to notice when her fingers brushed his. "You don't have to talk," he said finally. "Rest is enough." She nodded, but her eyes didn't leave him. He could feel her watching while he worked, the quiet between them stretching thin as wire. After a while, she rose again, slower this time, and managed 2 steps before he steadied her arm. Her touch lingered, soft but sure, like she was testing whether he was real. Jonah guided her to the table, setting a plate of bread and broth before her. They ate in silence, each motion deliberate, the crackle of the fire filling the space between breaths. When she looked up, there was something unspoken in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or gratitude too deep for words. He saw it, but didn't reach for it. Words felt too heavy for the room. When she finished eating, she whispered, "Why are you alone here?" He wiped his hands on a cloth. "Because it's easier." "Easier than what? Than losing someone again?" She looked at him, quiet and knowing. No answer came, just the long hush that settled after truth. Outside, wind brushed the walls like a hand passing over a wound. She rose again, stepped to the window, and watched the white world beyond. Jonah stood behind her without meaning to, both of them framed by the faint reflection in the glass. 2 strangers who had run out of words, yet somehow understood everything that needed saying. When the snow finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than the storm itself. Jonah opened the door and stared out at a world buried in white, the fences lost under drifts, the barn roof bowed beneath the weight. The air smelled clean, sharp, and endless. He stepped outside to clear a path while Clara sat by the window, her fingers tracing the rim of the teacup, eyes following his every move. By noon he came back in, his beard frosted, his coat stiff with cold. She had the fire going higher now, the kettle steaming, her cheeks touched with life again. "You shouldn't be on your feet so soon," he said. "You shouldn't have saved me," she answered softly. He glanced up. "You'd rather I hadn't?" Her gaze dropped. "I'd rather I knew why." He didn't answer, just took the cup she offered him. The warmth bit into his hands, grounding him in a way words never did. "Someone paid for that ad," she said after a while. Someone signed your name. Jonah nodded slowly. I figure so. You don't seem angry. He shrugged. Anger's a fire that don't heat the house. Clara studied him for a moment. Then maybe whoever sent me here wasn't wrong. He looked at her then. Really looked. The quiet strength beneath the tiredness. The way she met his eyes without flinching. You came to the wrong man, he said finally. I don't do saving, and I don't do promises. Maybe not, she said, her voice steady now. But you do keeping alive. He almost smiled. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing snow off the roof in soft cascades. From somewhere down the valley came the faint echo of a wagon bell, an intruder's sound after so much quiet. Jonah stiffened. No one should be traveling that trail today. Clara rose, her hand resting on the chair for balance. Could it be the post? Posts don't come this far till spring. He crossed to the window, eyes narrowing. A dark shape moved through the pale field below. A rider, slow and deliberate. You expecting someone? He asked. She shook her head. No one knows I'm here. He watched the figure disappear behind the trees, unease creeping through him like frost. Then someone's looking, he said. Clara's hand tightened on the chair. For me? He met her eyes, the firelight catching both their faces. We'll find out soon enough. By late afternoon, hoofprints scarred the white plain beyond the barn. Too clean, too deliberate to belong to a lost traveler. Jonah watched from the porch, his rifle resting across his knees, the air so still he could hear each distant creak of saddle leather. Clara stood in the doorway behind him, her shawl drawn tight, her breath fogging in the cold. That rider's been circling since morning, Jonah said quietly. Keeps to the trees, but he ain't lost. She didn't answer, just pressed the folded letter against her chest like a charm. When the figure finally came into view, Jonah rose. The man was thin, hat pulled low, a city cut to his shoulders. He stopped 10 paces from the fence and raised a hand in mock greeting. Afternoon, he called. Fine day to find what's mine. Jonah's grip tightened. You're a long way from fine. The stranger smiled, too easily. Name's Randall Pierce, out of Kansas City. I paid the agency for a bride. She ran off before the preacher could sign the paper. Clara's breath hitched. That's not true, she said, stepping forward. They told me you'd stopped writing. They said plenty, Randall cut in, but they left out that you owe me $200. Jonah stepped down from the porch, boots sinking deep into the snow. She don't owe you a thing. Randall's smile cracked. That's my wife you're talking to. No, Jonah said, his voice low, steady. That's a woman who survived what you turned her into. Randall's hand twitched near his coat, and Jonah leveled the rifle before he could finish the motion. You best ride back the way you came. The wind gusted between them, scattering snow like ash. For a moment no one moved. Then Randall spat into the drift, swung into the saddle and glared down. This ain't finished, mountain man. It never is, Jonah said. The rider turned and vanished into the line of pines. Silence fell heavy again, broken only by the crackle of ice sliding from the barn roof. Clara stepped beside Jonah, her face pale but fierce. He'll come back. Maybe, he said, lowering the rifle. But next time he won't find you cold. She looked up at him, eyes wet and steady. I wasn't until I got here. Jonah met her gaze, something unspoken rising in the air between them. Fear, defiance, and the beginning of belonging. That night the wind died, but neither of them slept. Jonah sat by the window with his rifle across his lap while Clara folded and refolded the same blanket, her movements restless, listening for hoofbeats that didn't come. The cabin felt too small for the worry between them. "He won't ride in the dark," Jonah said quietly. "Men like him need an audience." Clara nodded, though her fingers trembled as she poured water into a cup. "He said he bought me," she whispered, "like a mule. Then he forgot mules can kick." She almost smiled, but her eyes stayed on the fire. The hours crawled. Outside, the snow had hardened to glass, moonlight painting the valley silver. Jonah's thoughts kept circling the same trail, how a stranger's cruelty had carried this woman halfway across the country to die in his yard. He looked at her now. The strength returning to her face, and something inside him shifted. When the first sound came, it wasn't hoofbeats. It was crackling. Smoke curled through the floorboards before either of them smelled it. Jonah leapt to his feet, threw open the door, and saw orange light spilling from behind the barn. Flames licked the haystack, fed by wind that had returned from nowhere. "Stay inside," he shouted, grabbing a pail. Clara ignored him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and running into the snow. Together they fought the blaze, bucket after bucket, until their hands bled and their breath came in clouds. By dawn, the barn was blackened but still standing. Clara sank to her knees, coughing, hair streaked with ash. Jonah dropped beside her, chest heaving. "He did this," she said hoarsely. "He was here." Jonah nodded grimly. "And he'll come again." The fire's smoke still drifted upward, painting the sky with a bruise of gray and red. He turned to her, voice rough. "You could leave when the trail clears. Find another town, another start." She met his eyes, weary but certain. "And run forever? I didn't cross half this country to keep running." Jonah stared at her, snow melting in his beard, the weight of her words settling deep. For the first time since his wife's death, he realized the cabin wasn't just walls and wood. It was waiting for someone who refused to be erased. Outside, the wind changed direction, carrying the scent of smoke toward the valley like a warning that morning was coming with trouble close behind. The next morning broke too still, the air heavy in a way that made Jonah's gut tighten. The sky hung low and gray, and the valley carried no bird call, no wind, only the sound of snow softening under its own weight. Clara was already awake, mending a tear in her shawl at the table, her face calm but her hands quick. "He's close," she said quietly, not looking up. Jonah checked his rifle, loaded it, and slid the latch on the door. "He'll come from the ridge," he said. "There's no other trail that ain't buried." She tied the last knot, set the needle down, and stood. "Then I'll be ready." He turned, surprised. "You ain't fightin' him." Her eyes lifted to his, steady, unflinching. "I've been fighting him since the day I boarded that train." Before he could argue, the distant crunch of hooves broke through the stillness. Jonah moved to the window. A lone figure rode slowly down the slope, smoke-gray coat, hat low, posture calm as if he owned the valley. Randall Pierce. Jonah felt the air thicken. "Stay inside," he said again, but she stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "If I hide now, I'll never stop hiding." He looked at her, saw the same fire that had survived snow, fever, and shame. "Then stay behind me," he muttered. The rider stopped at the fence, dismounted, and called out, "You're a stubborn man, Hale. I came for what's mine." Jonah opened the door and stepped into the cold, rifle raised. "You came for a ghost," he said. Randall smiled, but his eyes were dead. "You think you can bury law with kindness?" "No," Jonah said evenly, "but I can stop cruelty at my gate." Randall's hand slid toward his hip, and for one long heartbeat the world held its breath. Clara's voice broke the silence, clear, strong, and final. "You don't own me." Randall froze, his gaze snapping toward her. She stood on the porch, shawl slipping from her shoulders, her face pale but fearless. "You bought a promise," she said, "but I'm not something to keep." Randall sneered. "Then you'll die here." Jonah didn't move. The next second split open with motion, a flash of metal, a thunderclap of gunfire, snow lifting like dust. When the echo faded, Randall was on the ground, his pistol half buried in red snow. Jonah lowered his rifle, breathing hard, as the sound of life crept slowly back into the valley. By noon, the sound of gunfire had reached the valley below, and men from the town came riding up the trail, their faces wary, rifles slung across their saddles. Word always traveled faster than truth in places like Silver Creek. Jonah stood by the porch as they dismounted, Clara behind him, wrapped tight in her shawl. Sheriff Ellison led the group, gray-bearded and quiet-eyed. He took in the scene. The body half covered in snow, the burned edge of the barn, the fear still flickering in the air, and then looked at Jonah. "You fired?" Jonah nodded once. "He drew first." The sheriff studied him a long moment, then turned to Clara. "You the bride?" She hesitated, then stepped forward. "I was the debt," she said simply. "He bought me from a broker in Kansas. Said I'd have a husband. Said I'd have a home." Ellison's jaw tightened. "And he followed you here?" "He lit the barn last night when we wouldn't open the door." The men exchanged glances. Jonah waited for someone to speak, but none did. Finally, the sheriff knelt, checked Randall's pistol, still half-cocked with powder burned along the barrel. "Looks to me like you told the truth," he said, standing again. "The town'll call it self-defense." Jonah exhaled, but only once. The weight didn't lift. Ellison turned toward the other riders. "Get a shovel," he said. "He'll go in the ground before nightfall." One of the men spat. "You're burying him here?" "No," the sheriff said. "At the crossing by the river. Let the wind take what's left of him." Clara stepped closer, voice low but certain. "I'll go with you." Jonah turned sharply. "You don't owe him a prayer." "No," she said. "But I owe myself one." The men loaded the body onto a wagon, and as they rode toward the river, Jonah and Clara followed on foot. The trail was silent except for the groan of wood and the hiss of melting snow. At the crossing, the sheriff paused. "Any words?" he asked. Clara looked at the water rushing cold beneath the ice. "You thought you owned my name," she said softly. "Now I take it back." Then she turned and walked away without looking back. Jonah followed, his boots sinking deep into the thawing mud. Behind them, the sound of shovels faded, replaced by the slow rhythm of the river reclaiming its peace. 2 days later, the town gathered outside the small chapel, half from curiosity, half from guilt. Word had spread about the fire, the shooting, and the woman who'd been sold a future and found her own instead. The sheriff had sent for Jonah and Clara to give their account, but when they arrived, no one spoke. They stood side by side on the steps, the mountain wind tugging at their coats. Clara's cheeks were pale, but her eyes held steady as the crowd watched. The preacher cleared his throat first. "Violence brings no blessing," he said. "If this man died by your hand, there must be repentance." Jonah's voice was calm, gravel worn smooth. "There's been enough repentance on this land to drown a church. What there ain't been is decency." The murmur rolled through the people like thunder in the distance. Clara stepped forward before he could say more. "He died because he believed he owned me," she said, "and the world let him believe it. The agency took his money. The church sold the vows. Every man who looked away helped dig that grave." The preacher's mouth opened, then closed. No one moved. The sheriff stood with his hat in his hands, eyes downcast. Clara looked over the faces. The blacksmith's wife, the storekeeper's son, the widows who'd sent for husbands they'd never met. "No woman should have to buy safety," she said quietly. "Not in God's country, not anywhere." The crowd fell silent. A young girl near the front slipped her hand into her mother's. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of pine and ash from the burned barn still standing miles away. The preacher finally bowed his head. "You have our word," he murmured. "This town will change its ways." Clara gave a small nod, then turned toward Jonah. His hand brushed hers, just enough to steady, not to claim. The sheriff stepped forward, voice rough. "You both are free to go. The matter's settled." Jonah tipped his hat once, guiding Clara down the steps. As they passed through the crowd, no one stopped them. A few women bowed their heads. Some men stepped aside. By the time they reached the end of the street, the church bell began to ring. Not for death, not for marriage, but for something new and quiet and clean. Clara glanced back once at the sound, her voice barely above the wind. "It's over." Jonah looked at her, his eyes tired but certain. "No," he said softly. "It's beginning. Spring came early that year, the mountains shedding their snow in silver rivers that cut through the valley like veins returning life to the land. The barn still bore its black scars, but the fences were mended, the soil turned, and smoke rose from the cabin's chimney once more. Jonah worked in silence, rebuilding what fire and fear had nearly taken, while Clara hung clean linens outside, her hands steady, her face open to the wind. The world felt different now, lighter, as though the mountain itself had finally exhaled. When he straightened from the trough, Jonah caught her watching him. She smiled faintly. "You don't stop much," she said. "Work's what keeps a man from thinking too long," he answered, wiping his hands. "Thinking's what kept you alive," she said, nodding towards the barn. He chuckled, the sound low and rough, like something unused to being free. "Maybe," he said, "but it was you who stayed standing when the fire came." She shrugged. "You said I was home." He looked at her then. Really looked. The sunlight caught in her hair, the strength where frailty used to be, the peace that had no need of permission. "I meant it," he said quietly. Didn't know how much until now. She walked toward him, bare feet brushing the thawed grass, and stood close enough for him to see the small scar by her temple where the cold had first marked her. "Then I'll hold you to it," she whispered. "This time home means both of us breathing." Jonah nodded once, unable to speak. Behind them, the bell from town rang faintly through the hills, carried on a breeze that smelled of new rain and wood smoke. Clara reached for his hand, fingers interlacing with his, grounding them both in the world they'd fought to keep. "What happens now?" she asked. He looked toward the horizon where the last snow melted into green. "We live," he said simply. They stood that way until the sun dipped low, painting the cabin walls gold. Inside, the fire crackled soft and even, no longer a guard against fear, but a sign of life itself. As dusk settled over Silver Creek, Jonah closed the door, and for the first time in years, he didn't bolt it. The wind outside was gentle now, the valley still, the mountain watching in silence as two people who'd found each other by accident began to build something no storm could take again.